Under an Illinois cornfield, a buried nation was waiting to be dug up, put behind glass, and sold as a tourist attraction for 65 straight years. The story you've probably heard about this place, a respected museum quietly preserving ancient Native American history, is wrong. What actually happened is a decades-long cover-up dressed up as education, run not by some rogue collector but by an entire state government, and later by the Illinois State Museum itself, an institution that spent 30 years protecting its own collection instead of the ancestors inside it. In 1991, one man decided he was done waiting for that institution to do the right thing. His name was Michael Haney, a Seminole and Sioux activist who had spent years trying to get officials to simply ask the tribes what they wanted done with their own dead. Nobody had listened. So he climbed past the railing, down into the exhibit pit itself, and started covering the exposed graves with his own hands. This is the story of Dixon Mounds, a bluff-top cemetery above the Illinois River, first opened to paying visitors in 1927, sealed shut in 1992, and more than 3 decades after federal law finally caught up with it, still not fully settled today. Today, Dixon Mounds carries every mark of legitimacy an institution can earn. It's part of the Illinois State Museum system. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1972. Archaeologists consider the skeletal population excavated here one of the most intensively studied ancient populations anywhere in North America, with decades of published research built on real bodies, real bones, real data. The site itself is bigger than most people assume. At least 10 burial mounds sit stacked on top of each other here, alongside 2 separate cemeteries and a platform mound holding an estimated 3,000 burials or more, just at this one location. Picture what that actually looked like for most of the 20th century. An excavated floor, sunk below ground level, ringed by a low railing, lit from above so every visitor could look straight down at bone. Families paid at the door. Schoolchildren filed through on field trips. And for decades, almost nobody in a position of authority asked the obvious question out loud. Who exactly benefits from keeping this open? The state got a tourist draw and a research collection in one building. The cost was paid by people who had been dead for the better part of 1,000 years, and by descendants who weren't in the room when any of these decisions were made. And it doesn't stand alone. Zoom out, and Fulton County alone contains thousands of recorded mound and village sites. Along roughly 80 miles of the Illinois River, archaeologists have identified a string of major settlements, evidence of a densely populated Mississippian world that thrived here between about 800 and 1300 CE. Whether Dixon Mounds is technically the single largest Native American cemetery ever preserved in North America is genuinely disputed. No archaeologist will hand you a clean, uncontested ranking because most of that regional landscape has never been fully excavated and probably never will be. But strip away the superlative and the honest version is still staggering. Thousands of recorded sites, an estimated 3,000 or more burials at this one bluff alone, and a documented population intensively studied for over half a century. Call it one of the largest. Call it one of the most significant. Either way, this wasn't some forgotten patch of prairie. It was a landscape full of people, full of towns, full of the dead. Which is exactly why what happened at Dixon Mounds for most of the 20th century is so hard to explain away. Because for 65 years, the museum wasn't a museum in any sense we'd recognize today. It was an open grave, and you could buy a ticket to walk through it. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to 1927, and to a man who had no business being the one who found this cemetery first, except that his family had been standing on top of it for generations. Don Dixon was a chiropractor, not an archaeologist. His family had farmed this land since 1833, when his grandfather settled here from Kentucky. Skeletons had turned up before, unearthed by plows, uncovered by erosion. The family knew what was under their soil. Don was simply the one who decided to dig deeper, and to stop covering it back up. He didn't remove the bones the way archaeologists of the era typically did, he cleared the dirt around them and left the skeletons exactly where they lay, pedestaled in the earth, grave goods still beside them. First, he put up a canvas tent over the exposed pit, then a permanent structure, and then he opened the doors to the public. In its first year, the site drew roughly 40,000 visitors, each paying 50 cents to look down at the dead. Newspapers at the time promoted it, using language that has aged into something close to an admission of guilt, framing the discovery as proof of a race that lived and died before Indians. It wasn't true, but it did something useful for the people running the exhibit. It detached the bones from any living claimant. If the people in the ground were some vanished, unrelated race, nobody needed to ask permission. Nobody needed to consult anyone. The dead became curiosities instead of ancestors, and that reframing would outlive Don Dixon by decades. That framing was not unique to one Illinois farm. Across the 19th and early 20th centuries, a broader idea took hold in American popular science, one now referred to as the mound builder myth, the claim that the earthworks scattered across the Midwest and South were too advanced to have been built by the ancestors of the native peoples living nearby, and must instead be the work of some lost, superior, extinct civilization. It was pseudoscience dressed up as wonder, and it served a very specific political purpose. If the mound builders were gone, extinct, disconnected from any living nation, then land taken from native peoples could not be framed as land taken from the people who had actually built these monuments. Dixon was not inventing that trick. He was simply the latest person to use it, on a smaller, more literal scale, turning the argument into a business model, one ticket at a time. He would later tell a room of scientists at a 1947 meeting of the Illinois State Academy of Science that he had grown up with this knowledge that the burials were practically in his own backyard, and that he had genuine affection for the people he had uncovered. It is a strange, almost tender thing to say about a business built on open graves, and it captures something true about how this entire situation was allowed to continue for so long, not through outright malice, but through a slow, generational normalization of something that should have felt obviously wrong from the start. By the 1940s, attendance had dropped, and in 1945, the state of Illinois purchased the site outright. The Dixon family kept managing it for the state for roughly 20 more years. Then in 1965, the site transferred fully to the Illinois State Museum. In 1972, a new museum building opened on the property, and the National Register listing followed that same year. On paper, this looks like a story of professionalization, a private curiosity absorbed into a respected public institution, given proper oversight, proper funding, proper science. But the open pit of skeletons did not go anywhere. It just got a nicer building around it. The state did not inherit a problem and fix it. It inherited a spectacle and legitimized it. A private roadside curiosity became a line item in a state budget, promoted by state tourism offices. Every layer of oversight added made the site more credible to the public and harder to question. Nobody decided to keep 300 exposed skeletons on display for another 25 years. It just kept not being anyone's specific job to close it. And the deeper you look into who these people actually were, the stranger that decision gets. Around 1000 CE, Mississippian culture spread northwest into this exact region from Cahokia, roughly 150 miles south, near modern St. Louis. Cahokia was, by any measure, one of the largest and most complex societies in pre-Columbian North America. A city whose population is estimated to have reached somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people at its peak between 1050 and 1150 CE, rivaling the size of major cities in Europe at the same moment in history. Its central earthwork, Monk's Mound, remains the largest prehistoric structure of its kind anywhere in the Americas. Trade goods found along the Spoon and Illinois rivers confirm this influence reached directly into the valley where Dixon Mounds sits. These weren't an isolated, forgotten people living in quiet obscurity. They were connected to an urban, sophisticated, expanding civilization, and the museum's own early marketing had spent decades selling the opposite impression. Monk's Mound alone covers more ground than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, built basket load by basket load, without draft animals or the wheel. That's the civilization whose reach extended into this valley, the northern edge of something closer to an empire. There's a second piece of evidence that complicates the story even further, and it comes from a nearby site called Larson. Excavated by archaeologists between 1964 and 1970, Larson was a 70-acre stockaded town, complete with its own platform mound and central plaza, one of several major Mississippian centers strung along this stretch of the Illinois River. And Larson didn't end peacefully. The evidence shows it was attacked and burned sometime around 1240. A fortified town, built with defensive walls, destroyed by fire in the same century, in the same valley, among the same broader population, buried at Dixon Mounds. That detail never made it into the quiet farming culture version of the story that dominated the exhibit for decades. It's much easier to sell tickets to a peaceful lost race than to a society that built walls because it needed them. A town of homes and public plazas, encircled by a defensive palisade, burned in a single violent episode around the middle of the 13th century. None of that made it onto the exhibit placards a few miles away. The picture being sold and the picture being dug up were quietly two different stories. So already, before we even get to the 20th century controversy, two things are true that the original exhibit never wanted you to know. These people weren't isolated, and they weren't uniformly peaceful. The museum's founding myth was built on both of those omissions, and it would take investigators, bioarchaeologists first, then activists, then lawmakers, decades to fully expose why those omissions mattered. The first real crack in the official version didn't come from a protest. It came from science, and specifically from the same bones the museum had put on display. In the late 1960s, more than 800 skeletons excavated at Dixon Mounds were sent on loan to the University of Massachusetts Amherst at the request of researcher George Armalagos, who was helping build the university's new anthropology PhD program. Over the following 2 decades, Armalagos and a team of researchers, including a young scientist named Alan Goodman, published more than a dozen papers using this single population. By 1990, other anthropologists were describing the collection as one of the most intensively studied skeletal samples anywhere in North America. The reason it mattered so much is simple. This population lived through a transition from an earlier late woodland foraging economy into full Mississippian maize agriculture in roughly the same place, generation after generation. That gave researchers something incredibly rare, a controlled before and after comparison of what farming actually did to the human body. Here's what that actually meant in the lab. Bones and teeth keep a record of the body's worst years. A tooth that stopped growing normally for a few weeks in childhood because of hunger or illness leaves a visible band in the enamel forever. Researchers call it a hypoplasia, but you don't need the term, just the idea. A scar left by a bad year at age 3 or 4, still readable centuries later. A skull with a slightly spongy, pitted patch above the eye sockets is often telling you the person was anemic as a child. A healed fracture, a worn joint, a patch of new bone growth on a shin, all of it is the skeleton keeping a diary nobody meant to write. Researchers spent years reading that diary page by page, cross-checking it against burial layer, against age, against sex, building a picture no single skeleton could give on its own. One doctoral study went a layer deeper, using trace element analysis, measuring specific chemical signatures locked into bone that shift depending on what a person actually ate over the course of their life. Put the enamel scars, the anemia markers, and the trace element diet data together, and you don't just get an educated guess about ancient health. You get a body of evidence dense enough that, decades later, other scientists still cite it as a baseline for how researchers study the human cost of the shift to agriculture anywhere in the world. The results reversed a comfortable assumption. Farming was supposed to mean progress, more reliable food, more stability, a step up from foraging. Instead, the skeletons told a different story. Enamel defects tied to childhood malnutrition rose by roughly 50%. Markers of iron deficiency, anemia, quadrupled. Bone lesions linked to infectious disease tripled. Signs of degenerative joint damage, consistent with repetitive hard labor, increased sharply. And life expectancy at birth, according to the published research, dropped from around 26 years before the agricultural transition to roughly 19 years after it. The switch to farming didn't save these people. In measurable, testable terms, it appears to have made their lives shorter and harder. That's not speculation. That's what the bones in that exhibit case were quietly proving, even while visitors walked past them, assuming they were looking at a simple, peaceful ancient people. And the health data wasn't the only inconvenient finding buried in that pit. A closely related nearby population, studied at a site called Norris Farms 36, showed something even starker. Bioarchaeologist George Milner and his colleagues documented unusually high rates of violent trauma there, roughly 1 in 6 individuals showing evidence of a violent death, alongside burned, palisaded villages across the region, scalping marks, embedded projectile points, a mass grave. Combined with the burned walls at Larson, this region starts to look less like a peaceful farming backwater and more like a landscape under real, sustained pressure, competition, conflict, and violence, layered directly beneath a museum exhibit that had spent decades selling exactly the opposite story to schoolchildren and tourists. None of this made the culture less remarkable. It made it more human, capable of monumental architecture, and also capable of building walls and losing people to raids. That's a harder story to sell. It's a truer one. Even the attempts to push the science further ran into a wall. In 1991, a researcher was approved to attempt something ambitious for the time, extracting genetic material directly from the ribs of 43 individuals in the collection, hoping to pull ancient DNA out of decades-old bone. The goal wasn't idle curiosity. Genetic data promised something the skeleton alone couldn't offer: a direct biological thread connecting these specific remains to specific living populations, the kind of proof that could settle affiliation questions decades before any law forced the issue. The extraction techniques available at that moment weren't up to the task. The attempt failed, and it was destructive on top of that. Samples taken from ancestral remains, damaged in the process, for a test that produced nothing usable. It's a detail that rarely makes it into the official history, but it matters. Even as late as 1991, this institution was still treating these bodies primarily as a resource to be sampled, not as ancestors to be protected. The instinct to test first and ask questions later hadn't gone away. If anything, it had just found a new, more technologically advanced form. That instinct was about to collide with something it couldn't outmaneuver. Through the 1970s and the 1980s, the American Indian rights movement had been steadily building momentum nationwide, and states across the country had begun restricting the excavation and display of native burials. Most museums had already removed human remains from public view. Dixon Mounds hadn't. By 1990, with a new federal law on the horizon, the museum's own leadership recommended closing the exhibit voluntarily ahead of the legislation, rather than in response to it. Illinois Governor James Thompson initially agreed. Then, under local political pressure, he reversed the decision. He argued the exhibit had never been a sideshow, that it was legitimate education, and more pointedly, that the tribes objecting to it had no special standing because they weren't directly related to the specific ancient people buried in that ground. Local officials backed him. The exhibit was, by then, an economic fixture, a reason for travelers to get off the highway. Closing it meant admitting the state had been wrong for a quarter century. Illinois, in 1990, wasn't ready to say that out loud. That argument didn't hold. It didn't stop the protests, and it didn't stop the federal law that arrived that same year. In 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, establishing, for the first time, a legal framework requiring museums to identify and return Native American remains and cultural items to culturally affiliated tribes. The exhibit at Dixon Mounds was suddenly standing in the way of a national reckoning, not just a local dispute. The activists didn't wait for the paperwork to catch up. This is the moment from the opening, the day the man who had spent years asking officials to simply consult the tribes finally stopped asking. At a public hearing, Michael Haney put the argument in words simpler than any legal brief. If you want to know about Indians, ask living Indians. Don't desecrate our graves. In April of 1991, Haney and other activists entered the exhibit hall. Officials reportedly expected some kind of ceremonial ritual. Instead, protesters began covering the exposed graves by hand, some jumping the railing into the pit itself, shovels in hand, symbolically reburying the ancestors the state had left uncovered for over 6 decades. No one was arrested, no one was prosecuted. Museum staff, by most accounts, simply stood back and watched it happen. The state had lost control of the narrative inside its own building, and everyone in that room knew it. Negotiations followed through the fall of 1991, and on April 3, 1992, under new Governor Jim Edgar, the burial exhibit officially closed to the public. Contractors sealed the pit permanently beneath a cedar plank floor. No doorway, no hatch, no planned way back in. The museum closed for renovation the following year, reopening in September of 1994 with a completely new interpretive exhibit, one built with the direct permission of consulting tribes, designed around native cosmology rather than open graves. The physical floor of that building today sits directly above the same burials that once drew 40,000 paying visitors in a single year. The spectacle did not end because the institution decided it was wrong. It ended because it was forced. Because sealing the floor solved the visible problem, the display, without solving the deeper one underneath it, ownership. Who did these remains actually belong to, legally, now that the law required an answer? And this is where the Illinois State Museum quietly built itself a loophole that would last another 3 decades. The museum adopted an internal standard, nothing predating 1673, the year French explorers Marquette and Joliet first passed through the region and produced written records, would be treated as culturally identifiable. Anything older, by this logic, existed in a kind of legal fog, too old for paper trails, and therefore, conveniently, too old to require return. It's worth being precise about what this meant in practice. Under that standard, the museum could continue holding thousands of native remains almost indefinitely, not because science couldn't connect them to living tribes, but because an internal policy had decided, in advance, not to try. Critics, including outside scholars and, eventually, the museum's own newer staff, have argued this wasn't neutral caution. It was a legal shield built to keep a scientifically and culturally significant collection out of NAGPRA's reach. Former museum directors have pushed back on that framing, insisting the 1673 line reflected legitimate scientific rigor about what could and couldn't be confidently proven. That disagreement has never fully been settled. But listen to how the museum's own retired site archaeologist, Dwayne Esseret, eventually described it once he was no longer bound by the institutional position "There's nothing special about 1673, he said. It's all history." A later museum director, Cinnamon Catlin Legutko, was even blunter when she looked back at the policy her institution had followed for decades. "It wasn't okay," she said, "and it's worth asking, plainly, who that policy actually served while it stood." Researchers got continued access to a landmark collection, decade after decade, for careers and publications built on studying it. The state avoided the cost, the logistics, and the discomfort of large-scale repatriation. The people who lost every single year the policy held were the descendant communities who had been legally defined out of the conversation entirely. It's worth being fair to the other side of that argument, because it wasn't invented out of nowhere. Museum leadership during those decades, including longtime directors who oversaw the collection for years at a stretch, maintained that connecting specific ancient skeletons to specific modern tribal nations, without written records, without documented continuous occupation, was genuinely difficult science, not an excuse. Cultural affiliation, under the law, has to be demonstrated, not assumed. That's a real standard, and it exists for real reasons. The problem critics point to isn't that the standard existed, it's that it was applied with unusual, almost total consistency in exactly one direction, for exactly one collection, for 30 straight years, while research access to that same collection kept getting approved almost automatically. While that argument played out internally, the numbers kept accumulating in the museum's favor, and not in a good way. The Illinois State Museum system ended up holding one of the largest collections of unrepatriated Native American remains in the entire country. Reported figures put the total above 7,000 individuals. Over 3 decades under NAGPRA, the museum returned a startlingly small fraction of them. Meanwhile, nearly every request from outside researchers to study or sample the collection further was approved. The pattern is hard to misread. For 30 years, this institution said yes to science and no to return, again and again, almost as a reflex. Then, in 2023, Illinois passed House Bill 3413, championed by a state senator who was, fittingly, an anthropologist by training. The law fundamentally changed the legal ground under the museum's feet. It shifted legal ownership of Native remains directly to Native nations, funded the creation of a protected reburial ground on state land, and established a dedicated repatriation fund. Around the same time, updated federal NAGPRA regulations took effect nationally, tightening the rules and closing many of the loopholes institutions like the Illinois State Museum had relied on for years. The 1673 defense, for the first time, had nowhere left to hide. On February 26, 2024, the consequences arrived in the form of a formal Federal Register notice, a notice of inventory completion, publicly filed and legally binding. It determined cultural affiliation for the remains of 1,325 individuals, along with more than 9,300 associated funerary objects, excavated from the Dixon Mounds complex. 12 tribal nations were formally listed as culturally affiliated, including the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma, the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin, the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, the Osage Nation, and several Potawatomi bands. It was, by some measures, the largest single repatriation determination in the museum's history, and federal data suggests that in 2024, this institution returned more ancestors than almost any other museum in the country. For each of those 12 nations, this wasn't an abstract legal formality. It was a list of names, ages, and burial locations connected, for the first time in decades, to a living government with the legal standing to demand them back. Descendants who had grown up hearing about Dixon Mounds as a place their ancestors were put on display could, for the first time point to a federal document and say, "That's ours," and the law finally agrees. After 30 plus years of resistance, on paper, the story finally seemed to be resolving, except it wasn't, because a signed federal notice is not the same thing as a completed act. As of now, physical reinterment hasn't finished. The process remains, by every available account, slow and bureaucratic, a tangle of consultation, logistics, and paperwork that hasn't caught up to the legal determination behind it. The remains excavated by Don Dixon in the 1920s are, right now, still sealed beneath that same cedar floor from 1992. The wing of the museum that sits above them stays locked. There is still no door. Walk through the museum today and you won't find a single skeleton on display anywhere in the building. The renovated exhibit, built with tribal consultation and opened in 1994, is called Reflections on Three Worlds, and it tells the region's story through native cosmology instead of open graves, sky, earth, and water, rendered in artwork and interpretation rather than bone. It's a genuinely different museum than the one Don Dixon built. But it's built on the same footprint, over the same cedar floor, over the same 600 and more sets of remains that have been down there since before most of the current staff were born. The silence of that space is deliberate now. For 65 years, the silence was the exhibit's biggest liability. Today it's treated as a form of respect. Whether that's enough, on its own, is exactly the question the tribes involved are still asking. Some of the change is real, and it deserves to be said plainly. The museum today looks different from the institution that fought this for 30 years. Logan Poppinfort, a citizen of the Peoria tribe of Indians of Oklahoma, now serves in a leadership role connected to tribal relations for the museum system, after years working directly at Dixon Mounds. In 2021, at tribal request, the museum removed roughly 40% of its own main archaeology exhibit, a direct acknowledgement that the old framing could no longer stand unchallenged. Outside, scholars have pushed the broader field to confront exactly this pattern, where institutions use technical uncertainty as a permanent excuse rather than a temporary limitation. The people inside the walls have changed. The floor is still sealed, and there's a deadline attached to all of this now. Under federal law, institutions across the country have until 2029 to fully complete their NAGPRA inventories and notices, or face real financial penalties. That clock is already running at Dixon Mounds and at hundreds of other institutions like it nationwide. So this isn't a closed case study from the past. It's an active, unfinished process, playing out right now on a deadline, in a building most visitors walk through without ever learning what's directly beneath their feet. There's also a quieter dispute still unfolding, less legal and more human. Many of the tribes involved have made clear they want reinterment to happen here in Illinois, on the land in the new state law set aside, not scattered elsewhere, not shipped out of the region their ancestors lived and died in. Lawmakers involved in drafting the new legislation have described the goal in blunt terms, avoiding forcing these remains to retrace, in reverse, the same kind of forced removal that defined so much of this country's relationship with Native nations. It's a small detail, it's also the entire argument in miniature, a fight not just over whether ancestors get returned, but over whether they get to finally rest in the ground they were taken from. And underneath all of it sits a bigger, unresolved question that this one museum can't answer by itself. Fulton County alone still holds thousands of recorded sites that were never excavated, never studied, never disturbed. Nobody knows exactly how many more burials are still out there, undisturbed, under corn and soybean fields, protected only by the fact that no one has dug them up yet. Every answer this investigation found, the health data, the violence, the loophole, the notice, the return still pending, only applies to the fraction of this landscape that was ever touched at all. The rest of the story is still in the ground, waiting for someone to decide whether it should stay there. So walk back, one more time, to that hall. The cutaway floor is gone now, replaced by cedar planks and a new exhibit built around native cosmology rather than open graves. Visitors move through it today without a hatch, without a railing over a pit, without ever standing directly above the 600 and more bodies still resting beneath that floor. Most of them will never know exactly where the line is drawn beneath their feet. Somewhere in a state archive, a federal notice sits, signed and dated, a legal document promising a return that, right now, today, still hasn't fully happened. Somewhere beneath a locked wing of a respected museum in the middle of Illinois farmland, hundreds of ancestors are still waiting under a floor with no door, for the one thing that was never actually about science at all, just to finally go home. Dixon Mounds was never really a mystery. It was a choice, made over and over for 65 years, about whose ancestors got to rest in peace and whose got sold as a spectacle. If this is the first time you're hearing what was actually underneath that museum floor, hit subscribe, because there are more sealed rooms like this one, still waiting to be opened. And here's what I want to know from you. Now that the law finally says these ancestors have to go home, do you think that floor should be reopened so it can finally happen? Or left exactly as it is, sealed, as its own kind of memorial?